Good evening. My name is Elisabeth Radow. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Larchmont and Mamaroneck. Welcome everybody here and everyone at home to our evening discussion about the update of the local Waterfront Revitalization program. League of Women Voters tonight has organized this program to educate people in the community about a program that was first instituted here in 1984, implemented after that with respect to the development of our community. And now it's time to take a look into the future. Want to read something to you that I found on the front page of the original LWRP. A bluff rose abruptly toward the west to a most commanding height in the form of an amphitheater, which soundward on its right and on its left also formed curves surrounding a beautiful bay with what was termed Delancey Point, or Neck, and Guyon's Neck, making a most beautiful and nearly landlocked bay frequented by wild fowls, in the corner of which was a small island that in the summer season on quiet days looked like an emerald surrounded by calm waters that appeared by sunlight or moonlight as if the emerald were set in glitter and flashing diamonds. That was written by A.C. Ferris about the Mamaroneck Harbor in the 1830s. So all these years later, we've got a developed waterfront and a community that's vibrant and an environment that is ever-changing. And we're here to update a plan that was first implemented from a Coastal Zone Management Commission consisting of our members of the community. Catherine Clark was the chairwoman of that committee. James Desmond, Paul Ryan, who's here this evening, Daniel Seisel, Mildred Warnicki. And there were help at that time from a variety of people, Charles McCaffrey from the Department of State, and Robert Funicello also took part, along with many others. We're going to be talking about the community, but the star of the show here is lying off to the, I guess it's the east, and that is the Long Island Sound. It was designated an estuary of national significance in 1987 by Congress. It is, as an estuary, it's a mixture of fresh water that consists of three major rivers, and that's the Housatonic, the Thames, and the Connecticut River, and it mixes with the salt water of the Atlantic Ocean. Some interesting facts about the Long Island Sound: it's got 600 miles of coast, and it is the home to more than 1,200 species of invertebrates, 170 species of fish, and dozens of species of migrating birds. The Sound has an area of 1,320 square miles, and it's 63 feet in depth, but ranging from 60 to 120 feet. It holds 18 trillion gallons of water, more or less, and there are an estimated 21 million people living within 50 miles of the Long Island Sound. I've looked at various reports, but it sounds as if 90% of the population lives around shorelines, and so you can think about the interplay of people and what we do and the impacts on the water. It is an estimated to have a value to the local economy of $8 billion each year. It is obviously an asset that we need to take care of. We use it for transportation, ferries, ships, barges, recreational boaters. We've got kayakers in the audience that I can see. Shellfishers, anglers, sunbathers, bird watchers. Many of us like to bring our children to the Long Island Sound to swim. So we are here this evening to think about how we're planning for the future to protect this treasure, this asset to our community, and how we as citizens in this community can play the important role in planning for the future. I'd like to ask everyone here to please sign in before you leave if you haven't already, because this is an ongoing process. This isn't an end in itself, and we want to be able to communicate messages to you. And if you're not here and you're listening at home, you can get a message to LMC-TV, and Eric Lewis or someone will get that message to me. We've got three wonderful speakers tonight, and after they speak, we're taking phone calls from people at home, and also people in the audience will have an opportunity to ask questions. Our first speaker this evening is Stephen Resler. He began his career as a marine scientist and an aquanaut. I'd never heard that phrase before, but now I have. And that was in his early career. He spent more than 15 years conducting experiments in and from an undersea laboratory. It gives underwater a new name. Steve later moved indoors as the coastal resources specialist and comprehensive planner, specializing in the development and implementation of coastal and other land and water use management and resources protections programs. Stephen is retired. He is the former Deputy Bureau Chief of the New York State Coastal Management Program at the New York State Department of State. Stephen will discuss the history of the local waterfront revitalization programs, federal, state, local levels, the interplay between these plans and local zoning and other laws, and how to implement a successful program, or an update, as is the case in Mamaroneck and Portchester, and the need for citizen involvement, as I mentioned, to achieve a successful long-term program. Please give a round of applause for Mr. Resler.
I see a lot of faces that I've dealt with in the past, so bear with me. Some of what you're going to hear tonight you've heard before. And I'm also out of practice when it comes to speaking to groups like this about the coastal programs. For the last 3 years, I've been more involved in esoteric academic and internal agency type stuff. So to avoid going off in the many tangents I often go off on, I'm going to use some written notes tonight. And I'll still go off on tangents on occasion, whenever a thought enters my head. So, in order to understand a local waterfront revitalization program, you first have to understand the underpinnings of the national and the state coastal management programs. And they all begin in the 1960s as a result, or the end result, of a failed national land use program. And I won't go into all the details of that, but toward the tail end of that effort, there was a group called a Stratton Commission that came out with many recommendations involving the nation's coasts, water quality, natural resources, and a few other things. And it resulted in the creation of what is today known as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. One of the major recommendations of that commission was the enactment of some national coastal legislation. And I'm going to probably bore some people here tonight with background on that, but you really have to understand it, and you have to understand the complexities of that legislation and the issues that we have to deal with in the coast in order to understand anything about trying to manage it at the many levels of government and among the many agencies at those levels of government that have roles to play in what private individuals do and what government does in shaping the coast. So, the Coastal Zone Management Act itself was first enacted in 1972. In my opinion, it was then and remains today light years ahead of any other legislation dealing with land and water uses and natural resources protection. Among other legislative findings, Congress found that the nation's coastal zone and its resources were subject to increasingly competing demands of population growth and development, the need to protect important natural resources. And as I say this stuff, I'm talking about 1972 now. Think about today. I think you're going to realize that not a lot's changed in the past 30 years or so. And the need to comprehensively plan for and manage the wise use, development, and protection of coastal resources and the coastal zone generally. Congress recognized that the means for managing or balancing these competing objectives, and I want you to pay attention to the word competing versus the word conflicting as I go through this talk tonight, demands is best accomplished through state coastal management programs and ensuring that activities comply with and are undertaken in a manner consistent with those programs. I'm using the word programs. Wherever I use the term programs, it also includes many plans that are implemented by or implement programs. The findings of Congress are embodied both in the Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act itself, and they include, and there's a long list here because I want you to understand how complex this is. A national interest in effective management, beneficial use, protection, and development of the coastal zone. The coastal zone is rich in a variety of natural, commercial, recreational, ecological, industrial, and aesthetic resources of immediate and potential value to the present and future well-being of the nation. Increasing and competing demands for industry, commerce, residential development, recreation, extraction of mineral resources and fossil fuels, transportation and navigation, waste disposal, and the harvesting of living marine resources have resulted in the loss of those living marine resources, wildlife, nutrient-rich areas, permanent and adverse changes to ecological systems, decreasing open space for public use, and shoreline erosion. Habitat areas of the coastal zone and its living marine resources and wildlife are ecologically fragile and consequently extremely vulnerable to destruction by human alterations. Important ecological, cultural, historic, and aesthetic values of the coastal zone, which are essential to the well-being of our citizens, are being irretrievably lost or damaged. New and expanding demands for food, energy, minerals, defense needs, recreation, waste disposal, transportation, and industrial activities are placing stress on coastal areas and creating the need for resolution of serious conflicts, again, between and among important competing uses and values in the nation's coastal area. Special natural and scenic characteristics are being damaged by ill-planned development that threatens these values. Land uses in the coastal zone and the uses of adjacent lands draining into the coastal zone may significantly affect the quality of coastal waters and habitats. The word may was changed in the 1990 amendments to the CZMA to make it very clear for the first time in any legislation, national or state, that coastal water quality is in fact significantly affected by and impaired by land uses. And efforts to control coastal water pollution from land use must be improved. All of this remains today, 30 years later, by the way. And as a lead-in to another speaker later on, this is not new. Because global warming may result in substantial sea level rise with serious adverse effects in the coastal area, coastal states must anticipate and plan for such occurrences. Stuff's not new. In light of competing, not conflicting, but competing demands and the urgent need to protect and give high priority to natural systems and inadequate institutional arrangements for planning and regulating land and water uses in the coastal zone, the key to more effective protection and use of land and water resources in the coastal zone is by encouraging states to exercise their full authority, which they rarely exercise, by the way, over coastal lands and waters through coastal management programs that include unified policies. And policies is important here because I'm going to talk about those later. Criteria, standards, methods, and processes for dealing with land and water use decisions that are of more than local importance. Congress also found and declared in the Act that it's a national policy to preserve, protect, develop, and where possible restore or enhance the resources of the coastal zone for present and future generations, and accomplish this through those state programs, which should provide, at the very least, for the protection of natural resources, which include wetlands, floodplains, estuaries, beaches, dunes, barrier islands, and fish and wildlife habitats, the management of development to minimize loss of life and property caused by improper development in flood zones, storm surge areas, geological hazards, and erosion-prone areas and areas likely to be affected by or vulnerable to, capital letters, sea level rise, land subsidence, saltwater intrusion, and by the destruction of natural protected features such as beaches, dune, wetlands, and barrier islands. The management of development to improve, safeguard, and restore the quality of coastal waters and protect resources and existing uses of those waters. Throughout this summary, I use the term uses. The coastal programs and your local waterfront program, which is an element of a coastal program, is primarily a land and water use program. Zoning is very important in implementing this program and many of the policies we'll talk about as we go through this. Priority consideration to coastal dependent uses. The term coastal dependent means it's something that is dependent on a location in the coastal area in order to function and exist. The word is distinguished from water dependent. For example, a water dependent use is a use that can only be conducted or function as a use on, in, over, under, or adjacent to the water. If it can be done on the upland, it is not water dependent. This is important because priority consideration is given to water dependent uses in, on, over, or under the water, and we should not be allowing for non-water dependent uses in that finite amount of space, which is also the most physically dynamic, the most biologically productive, and the most populated region of the world. And given that, the most complicated and socially difficult area of the world. Public access to the coastal recreation is required to be included in these programs. Assistance in the redevelopment of deteriorating urban waterfronts and ports, and sensitive preservation and restoration of historic cultural and aesthetic resources. The coordination and simplification of procedures to ensure expedited government decision-making for the management of those resources and areas. And lastly, consultation and coordination with and giving adequate consideration to the views of affected federal agencies. To create a partnership between the federal government and the coastal states, the CZMA, the Act itself, encouraged the states to develop coastal programs and to adopt sufficient legal authority to implement those programs. What Congress did was allow states considerable flexibility in deciding how to develop a program and how it would be implemented, provided the states have the legal authority to implement in whatever manner the states came up with. So there was no black and white fixed cookbook means of developing a program, provided they included as elements of them those things that I just summarized for you. In many cases, almost every case, in every state that has a coastal program, the states had to enact brand new legislation to make the programs work. In return for the development of a coastal program, the federal government waived what we call its sovereign right to undertake its own actions or make its own decisions in the coastal area without interference from the states. This is one of the most important elements of the National Coastal Program, and you'll see how it affects the state and local programs as well as we go through this. Anything requiring any form of authorization from a federal agency, any funding by a federal agency, and anything undertaken directly by a federal agency, either in the coastal area or outside of the coastal area, but having any reasonably foreseeable direct or indirect effect on any coastal resources, whether natural or human, or any use of the coastal area, is subject to consistency with the state's coastal policies. In the state of Ohio, not too long ago, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency was considering issuing what they call, or approving what was called the State Implementation Plan for the discharge of industrial waste into the air in Ohio from industrial factories. Those emissions make their way into the Adirondack region of New York. They're deposited in the Adirondack area on land and in its waters. They drain down to the Mohawk River and elsewhere. Some of them drain north to the St. Lawrence Seaway in New York. Others drain to the Hudson River, which is also part of the coastal area, and down to New York City and into the Atlantic and Long Island Sound. It affects New York's resources, and it affects our human uses of those resources. We can reach into Ohio and tell EPA whether their approval of the state's implementation plan for the discharge of pollutants into the air is or is not consistent with New York coastal policy. And if we say it is not consistent with New York policy, EPA cannot approve it. That's the power of a state coastal program, and we use it every day in New York, or we, the state agency I used to work for, uses it every day. It's a tremendously powerful tool. After 8 years of development, after the CZMA was enacted, New York finally developed and got approved its coastal management program in 1982. There are 5 primary means for implementing the program. One is comprehensive planning, primarily through local waterfront revitalization programs, which are detailed, comprehensive plans for the coastal area of a municipality. Regional coastal management programs, there is one for Long Island Sound, and it is distinguished from the Long Island Sound Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan pursuant to the Clean Water Act. They are different programs, and what distinguishes the Long Island Sound Coastal Management Program from the Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan is that the coastal program is fully enforceable. The Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan through the Clean Water Act is not enforceable. The advocacy of activities that advance or further state coastal policies or the policies and purposes of a local waterfront revitalization program. Technical assistance to state agencies, local governments, and the private sector, and sometimes the federal government. The funding of studies, plans, and projects to advance coastal policies and LWRPs, and the land and water use plans in an LWRP. And through governmental review and decision-making processes to ensure that activities are fully consistent with the policies and purposes of an LWRP. And I was going to save this toward the end and explain what consistency really means and how it's distinguished from other types of decision-making. Most of us are familiar with the National Environmental Policy Act or the State Environmental Quality Review Act, and the balancing of the pros and cons of actions in decision-making. So we're allowed through the National and the State Environmental Quality Review Acts to balance the great and wonderful benefits of something against relatively minor adverse effects and allow it to proceed. That is not allowed in coastal consistency decision-making. You are not allowed to balance one objective against another and advance one objective to the detriment of another. What distinguishes this program from every other type of decision-making in this country is that you have to achieve and advance every objective or every policy that applies given the circumstances. And I was telling someone earlier tonight that a judge once said to me that it's impossible to do this. These policies conflict. You have a policy that basically says you should facilitate and encourage and facilitate the siting of, in some cases, heavy industrial water-dependent uses along the shoreline. And at the same time, protect, preserve, and where practical, restore the viability of habitats for their value as habitats. You can't achieve those two. And I had to say, you can, Judge, and it's actually very simple. It's a matter of siting. You simply don't put that heavy industrial water-dependent facility in that habitat or in an area where it would affect the habitat or impair its viability as a habitat. It's as simple as that. You put that heavy industrial facility 10 miles up the coast where there's sufficient infrastructure to support it and where it also complements the current development there or advances some long-range plan to develop that area. You then leave that habitat alone. You achieve both objectives, and you achieve all the objectives in between those two and on either side of them. And by the way, there are 44 policies and policy objectives in New York, which we'll run through quickly. And I'll be done soon, I hope. There are 44 policies. These are enforceable policies. They're meant to guide decision-making. They're enforceable through constitutional provisions of the state, through statutes, through agency regulations, through what we call administrative decisions, which are quasi-judicial in a way where you go before an administrative law judge in an agency, and that judge considers what's before them as well as agency regulations to decide matters almost like a court does out in the public realm. Judicial decisions also make law, make policy. Policies are reflected in judicial decisions. So there are 44 policies in New York, all derived from those various sources. They're grouped into 10 categories: appropriate types and levels or scale of development in appropriate areas, fish and wildlife, flooding and erosion, think sea level rise again. And by the way, when we talk about sea level rise, we're talking about every one of these other subjects as well. Public access, recreation, historic resources, visual quality, agricultural lands, energy, and ice management. Ice management isn't a big issue here, but it is in the St. Lawrence, where there is ice breaking to keep commercial shipping open in the wintertime, and water and air resources. These 44 policies are explicit statements of policy that are required to be used in agency decision-making, and they provide the standards for the CMP. They're the heart of it. They are the standards for decision-making for both the development and the implementation and subsequent decision-making regarding LWRPs, and they implement national coastal objectives in addition to state and municipal objectives. Essentially what we're doing here is at the local level, developing a comprehensive plan for a municipality using some general national and state policy objectives, shaping those policies and objectives given the circumstances on the ground in a municipality developing a long-range plan for what it would like to see done in its coastal area, which in some cases, like Marinette, can include the entire municipality. That local program is subsequently, if approved by the state, as an element of the state coastal program, forwarded on to Washington, D.C., where the federal government, we hope, concurs with the state's approval of that. And essentially, we have a national, state, and local government land and water use program that binds all three levels of government to achieving what that program says is to be achieved in preventing what we want to prevent in the coastal area of that municipality. It removes much of the discretion at each level of government and among levels of government and among the agencies, so that theoretically all agencies at every level of government are making the same decisions to target permits, money, and direct undertakings by government to achieve specific results or make things happen where they should happen and prevent them from happening where we don't want them to happen. It is highly effective when used properly. In 1981, in order to make all of this work, New York enacted Article 42 of the state executive law. It has a couple of important elements of it. One is a statement of coastal policy that almost reiterates what the national CZMA says. It has an option for municipalities to prepare local programs as formal components of and amendments to the state coastal program. And those programs, those LRPs, will contain land and water use plans within them, which are reflected to a large degree by municipal zoning and other special purpose laws to make a land use plan work. And a requirement similar to the federal requirement that state agencies conduct their decision-making in a manner consistent with state coastal policy or the policies and purposes of an approved LRP. State agencies are no longer allowed to make their own decisions on their own. They have to consult with an LRP, look at the document, look at the policies, and ensure that their decision-making comports with those policies and the land and water use plan in the document. If, for example, a state agency is considering a permit for something that isn't allowed through the municipal zoning law, it's not a permitted use, the state agency is required to immediately deny it. There's no discretion involved. Deny. Don't go through the secret process. Deny immediately. You have no discretion. That's the way it's supposed to work. And I'll skip a lot of the other stuff I have in here because I don't have much time. The elements of an effective LRP, which I was asked to comment on tonight, are fourfold, in my opinion, based on my experience with this. And I did develop programs for almost a half a decade before moving off into the regulatory realm and trying to ensure that things comport with local programs. A strong commitment and involvement by local elected officials and municipal planning and other staff without having the full support of your chief elected and other local elected officials, you'll never get an LRP to work. A community-driven vision and involvement in guiding desired direction of a comprehensive plan for the coastal area of the municipality. You have to include the public. The public has to have a voice in what it wants its coastal area to literally look like into the future. A strong core group of citizens working on a regular basis with municipal and or New York Coastal Management Program staff. For years, our staff, the staff in the coastal program, dedicated one or more individuals to each community in the state. And that individual would work one-on-one with the community. I've had town supervisors and mayors say, we love you guys, you're here more than my own staff, and I can rely on you people for answers to technical problems that we have. That's been reduced, by the way, the past few years because the state budget hasn't allowed people to get out of Albany into those municipalities, but it's important that that connection be made and remain. And where there is no municipal staff, with good consultants who have the experience to work with you to develop a program and implement it. And they all have to have strong technical skills in planning and understanding the various means of implementing comprehensive plans and multi-governmental levels of authorities and the related means of advancing those plans. So it's not just project planning, it's comprehensive planning, whether natural resources protection or economic development or transportation or recreation. We're talking real planning here. Dedicated and one dedicated and special municipal entity, in almost all cases that I've come across in New York, a local commission or a board, an advisory council, or a municipal department or agency with members or staff knowledgeable of the local waterfront revitalization program, meaning your document and what it says and the direction it's trying to take you in and the means of implementing that document. And in addition to knowing that, for reviewing activities of local government agencies, of state agencies, and of federal agencies against the policies and purposes of your local waterfront program, and then advising the state of the consistency of those actions with your LRP. So what that means is that when someone applies for a federal permit to do something in your municipality, you as a municipality will be asked to comment on that and let the Department of State know whether or not there might be any conflicts between what's being considered by the federal agency and the policies and purposes of your local program. We're not asking for a formal decision. We're simply asking for you to comment on and let us know, or let the department know, I keep saying us, whether there are any conflicts the department should be aware of. And if there are, the department will include that in its decision, which will determine whether or not the federal agency may or may not authorize, fund, or undertake whatever it is they're considering. This can get too complicated and I won't go on and on, but it's basically that level of involvement by a municipal entity that will determine whether or not you're able to achieve the objectives of a local waterfront revitalization program. You have to have a centralized, committed entity that knows your program inside and out and is responsible for the overall implementation of it in order to make all of this work. In my experience, it has not worked where the authorities of implementing various elements of an LWRP and the decision-making involving it is scattered among agencies. That's the way the state of New York attempts to do this, and it is the weakest link in the entire process. The Department of State gets to make decisions involving federal agencies, and only the Department of State can determine whether something is or is not consistent with state policy or the policies of and purposes of an LWRP in the federal process. No state court, no other state agency, not the Supreme Court of the United States, not the President of the United States, or anybody gets to second-guess that decision. The result of the decision, which is that if the department determines that something is not consistent with state policy, that determines whether or not a federal agency can or cannot undertake something. So if the Department of State says it's not consistent with state policy, the federal agency is prohibited from authorizing it. That decision can be appealed. There is an override process to go through. You don't get to overrule. And it's very difficult. It's a very difficult standard to meet. It involves national security and the advancement of some major coastal objective to a huge degree in order to result in an override. It's very rare that that's done. That's essentially it. The point I want to make here is that without that grassroots community involvement, without having some municipal entity retain and maintain overall authority over the implementation and review of an LRP and the review of activities for the consistency with it, the program simply won't work.
Stephen, before we bring on Frank Fish, could you help us to understand, now we're at a stage where we're going to update the LWRP. What is entailed legally? We don't start de novo. What happens now that we're taking a second look for the next 50 years?
It's a very broad question. What happens legally? In order to implement elements of an amended program, or
no,
procedurally?
What's procedurally? what are we called upon as a community to do now that we're updating it, that Frank is going to talk about? We don't start all over again, do we, or do we?
I don't know exactly where you are in your process at this point. 'Cause
Okay, well, maybe,
I haven't
does
been
it make
involved in
sense?
it.
Okay, you know what, then
But-
we can, maybe
Okay.
I'll introduce Frank and then you'll
All
jump
right.
in. Okay, thank you.
But I will say that the amended program goes through a process very similar to the initial approval of a program.
Okay.
When a municipality first considers amending a program, they include the community in another visioning process, if you will, or taking a good look at your program, deciding whether or not, there obviously had to have been a decision to change something or update something in order to go through the amendment process. So the community should have been approved at some point, and to some degree. In order to do that, you initiate the secret process early on, because you're now undertaking an amendment to a major comprehensive plan that will have, theoretically, significant effects, not necessarily significant adverse effects, but these things significantly affect the environment. So you've got to initiate the secret process and consider that early on in the process. And I also mention that because an LWRP is itself an EIS. You don't have to do a full-scale document that we're most familiar with in the secret process, separate and apart from an LWRP. The elements of an LWRP, the summary of the summary inventory and analysis, the summary of issues and opportunities, the policy development, the land and water use plan in it, the analysis of all those issues, goes even beyond what an EIS would address pursuant to secret. So the document itself is your secret document. That's important to understand, which is another reason why you have to initiate or should initiate the secret process very early on. When that's all completed, the Department of State and the municipal government will both be involved agencies in the approval of this thing. It'll be coordinated carefully with the Department of State. Secretary of State has to make specific findings in order to approve the amendment, and then it's forwarded on to Washington, D.C. For the federal government's concurrence with that amendment to that program as a formal element of the state's program.
Okay.
Once that happens, all three levels of government are bound to the policies and purposes of that program and have to include them in all their decision-making from that point on.
Okay, great. Thank you. There's going to be a test on this in the morning. Well, obviously, this is complicated. What impresses me is that this sounds like this is sacrosanct, and that there aren't other levels of government that would typically be able to override. But once this is put in place, this sets a standard. Frank Fish is going to come and speak now. He is a planner, founding member of Buckhurst Fish, and is it Jacquemart? Jacquemart. It's planning and design firm, Frank oversees the firm's planning, environmental analysis, and real estate consulting. The focus of Frank's practice is comprehensive planning. He led the firm's effort to complete the Rockland County Comprehensive Development Plan and update Nassau County's Comprehensive Master Plan. And in addition, Frank has worked on several waterfront programs in our region. Frank is a current consultant on the update to the Mamaroneck and Portchester LWRPs. Frank will discuss the current proposed LWRP update for Mamaroneck. Please welcome Frank Fish.
Good evening. It dawned on me as I saw Steve up here, and I know I'm going to be followed by Adam, that we're speaking in, if you don't mind my saying this, Steve, in descending order of age. So Steve, to me, started off the way I was taught to start off in school, and that is very good, solid presentation on exactly what does the program entail in the law. And he's able to do that with practically no notes. He knows it so well. I am in the middle generation of using boards, which I'm used to doing as simply props, and I'm going to go through one example of an LWRP, and as has been said, that's the Village of Mamaroneck. And then I'm going to be followed by Adam with the high technology PowerPoint. So hopefully you'll get 3 different types of presentations this evening. But I always have learned something. I've told my staff that when we're going to do a new project, to get the documents, get the actual state law or the federal law, and also get the manual. And I asked them to get, when we are going to update Mamaroneck again, I just wanted to read it, just look at it again, make sure I was familiar with things. And the New York Coastal Management Program, the manual, I just looked at whose name is on it, and that's Steve. So there is no better authority, I think, although I will say, I'm not going to try to advertise Steve, but this is the best card I've ever seen. It has on it for Steve he's underwater with goggles and so on. So he is really a serious scientist, and I'm very humbled to follow him, actually. But what I'm going to do, or try to do, is pick up a little bit on what he said from the national and state perspective and try to bring it down to a local perspective as an example. And he mentioned that the federal law was passed basically in 1972. However, other things have happened. The state of New York then followed with their own law. The feds essentially leaving to the states a lot of flexibility as to how the state would do their coastal zone management program. It left the flexibility of whether a community was going to do an LWRP or not. And then it left the flexibility of the community what the projects of that LWRP, if they chose to do it, what the projects would be, and also what the zoning would be. So there is a considerable flexibility in developing the LWRP at the local level. And then I want to distinguish it from one other element that New York State in the mid-90s, around 95 or so, changed its legislation on comprehensive planning, which I want to distinguish an LWRP from. There's a lot of communities in New York State that don't have a waterfront, therefore they don't have an LWRP. A comprehensive plan, the New York State comprehensive plan legislation, is what we usually refer to as the master plan of a community. And a lot of communities have such plans. They're to encompass, by their very word comprehensive, the whole community. An LWRP does not need to do that. It may, in the case of the village of Mamaroneck, encompass a whole community, or it may, in the case of Rye, encompass only the area along the waterfront, or in Portchester, where we're doing the update now of their LWRP, primarily it's the Byram River in Portchester. Most of the rest of the village is not in the LWRP. So today we have both LWRPs and comprehensive plans. For instance, the village of Mamaroneck has its own comprehensive plan also for the whole village, as does Portchester, where we're also working now. And then there's a third law, which we also have to comply with, and I was very encouraged to hear Steve's comments on SEQR, the State Environmental Quality Review Act. In 1969, the federal government passed something called the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. And then New York State was one of 2 states, California and New York, that followed it very carefully and set up a state process of EIS, or at least environmental review. So the LWRP that we do in New York State needs to be related to the village or the town's or the city's comprehensive plan, if there is one, and zoning code. And then it also needs to be related to the State Environmental Quality Review Act. And in Mamaroneck's case, we have started both, so that they can be done in sync. That is both the SEQR, which Steve mentioned, and the LWRP. So I thought what I would do is just go to the LWRP itself. Again, I'm a little bit humbled here. We became involved with the village of Mamaroneck in 1981, so I've been involved a long time. But it was at that time, 1982 and 83, Steve mentioned Catherine Clark as leading a citizen committee, citizen-generated committee. But I also want to recognize Paul Ryan's in the audience. He was on that committee at the time. And there was local leadership and a local mayor, Paul Noto. And that plan, that LWRP, was developed largely by a citizen group, but it also had strong leadership, municipal leadership, which Steve was emphasizing. And I believe Paul Noto and the trustees adopted that in 1984. The correspondence back and forth, all signed by the mayor. And I would reiterate what Steve said on the components of success of an LWRP. I think I was wondering what Steve would say, because I knew he was asked to talk about that. And I jotted down 4 things for the success of an LWRP. And it turns out that my very first one was Steve's: strong local leadership. By that I mean the mayor and the trustees. The elected official has the power to adopt the LWRP. Second, exactly what Steve said, you've got to have good public participation, organize a good waterfront committee, a so-called WAC, Waterfront Advisory Committee. Mamaroneck has one, had one then, a terrific committee. I did see it in action as the planner for the planning board at that time in the 1983-84 period. And now Mamaroneck has another committee, and one of its members is here, George Schiefendecker, tonight. So in Mamaroneck, I think we've been blessed with a strong local leadership and a committee that has been of dedicated volunteers that have been experienced. The current committee, everyone on it has been on some other board or is currently on another board. So I think those are 2 components. I listed a third that's Steve didn't, but I'm going to list it now, and that is have a limited time frame. And I don't mean this in the sense of Mamaroneck or Portchester, but we have been working on one in Hudson, New York, which is a famous one, since 2006. If you don't have a limited time frame to do this, 1 to 2 years, it's called the election cycle. You need a time frame, and you need to stick to the time frame. If it extends and it gets into other boards and future boards, it's very hard to maintain momentum. And for a volunteer, a committee member dedicating so much time, it's hard to keep the momentum. So I would add that limited time frame. I wasn't going to mention consultants because I am one, but I find that committee members, when you ask, unless you have a really dedicated committee, it's hard to ask volunteers to write the draft. Usually it's easier for the committee to actually use staff, if there's a staff planner, or a consultant to at least write the draft to get it going. And then the committee has the final edit and say before they send it to the elected officials. And that is the very method that Mamaroneck Village is using right now. For instance, we have right now an active draft. It's a preliminary draft that the committee is studying, they're developing, and they're going to go ahead and get public input on. They've had one workshop already. I'm going to take this opportunity to advertise the second one, Dan, if you don't mind. It's Saturday. It's June 11th. It's from 10 to 12 in the morning. There's going to be a whole announcement going out from the village manager's office on this. So there's going to be a continuing attempt in this local Mamaroneck LWRP to meet that component of real public participation, because it has to be a community-driven vision, as Steve said. And so I agree with all of his points. I would just add my great hope, as I once learned as a consultant when I worked for a committee, and this was in the town of Warwick, and it was not a LWRP, it was a comprehensive plan. Nobody on the committee was from the town board, and there were no joint meetings with the town board, and the town board was uninformed. And when I got to the town board, they looked at me and said, "What are you doing here? Who are you?" I had worked for a year with a committee, and the decision maker wasn't involved. The decision maker of all these plans is the elected official, period, in New York State. It takes 5 votes to adopt an LWRP. They are the decision maker. They have to vote to adopt the LWRP. So that first component of a engaged elected official is important. And the second one, though, it just is essential that you have community involvement. But we had that in 1984, and it produced, I believe, New York State's first Long Island Sound Coastal Zone Management Plan, the LWRP of the Village of Mamaroneck. So what our job now is, we have a tremendously good document, a solid base, and our job is made so much easier because we're simply updating what is already in place. By the way, I don't want to say that the effort is de minimis. It's not. There's a tremendous effort that's going to go into the update because a lot's happened. We were talking earlier that anyone under 40 in my firm does not know what an IBM Selectric was or is. The 1984 plan, when you look at it, and when I look at our 1986 Mamaroneck Comprehensive Plan, IBM Selectric, I don't think Macintosh was quite out yet. I remember in our firm we first got Macintoshes, and then we had to change to Microsoft because it dominated all the traffic and engineering components. But now, so much has happened since 1984, substantially also. When you look at the 1984 plan, the LWRP of Mamaroneck, there's 2 maps in it. I'm going to go through these boards, and you're going to see our hope is to have maybe 20 or 25 maps in the new LWRP. Why? We have the graphic capability now and the level of detail that we can get both from Westchester County, the state, and the village to do that. So hopefully this will make it a little bit of a user-friendly plan and also aim, quite frankly, at today's audience. I find today's audience tends to read on a couple of different levels. I still like to sit at home with no distractions or go to a library, and I like to read a document in detail. But I find a lot of people will read a document looking at the titles, the subtitles, and the graphics. So we're trying to do the document on both levels. We also have a lot that happened in the village. As every town and village does, wherever you are, since 1984, the village adopted its own comprehensive plan in 1986. Then the village went on from 88 through 94 on a whole set of zoning changes within the village. Then it adopted new floodplain regulations. Then it adopted new wetland regulations. And then in 2008, it updated its master plan and revised its zoning and introduced something called FAR, floor area ratio, which controlled all the clubs along the waterfront in a more careful, I would say, manner. So the new update has now a lot to incorporate in it. There's a lot of new information that we can get in it. And what it does is it follows what was just laid out by Steve, and that is if you look at the table of contents, by the way, you all will be able to get this. We'll have copies at the workshop, and then this will be
most information is on the website.
Thanks, Dan.
The only thing that's not there at this point is something Charlie's working on.
Great. So this is all on the website, and it all follows really the directives in terms of content, table of contents that is laid out for us by the state. It goes through an inventory and analysis of the waterfront, goes through what are our proposed projects. I'm going to go through a few of those. It goes through the local laws necessary to implement. And one other person I want to very much mention here, we're kind of gifted in the village of Mamaroneck, I feel. Earlier tonight, again, Steve mentioned to me his first 6 years, if I got that right, at the state of New York, he was working for a man named Charles McCaffrey. Charlie McCaffrey worked for DOS for many, many years, was involved in the 1984 plan with Paul Ryan, who's here, and Charlie is working on this with us. The village has retained Charlie. Retired from the Department of State, I think about 7 or 8 years ago or so, 2000. So he's very familiar with these policies, and Charlie is actually condensing the 44 policies. We're not going to lose the 44. They're all still going to be in the plan, but he's condensing them into fewer policies to represent the new products of the Long Island coastal policy. So he's just finished that, and in fact, our committee will be getting that tomorrow evening. We have a committee meeting in the village. So where we are in this plan now is really on the, I'm going to just go over the inventory part of it a little bit just to give you an example of that this evening. And I just wanted to mention we've now mapped out this I probably shouldn't touch that so you can zoom in on it. But this first map indicates all of the floodplain areas in the village of Mamaroneck. And I don't have to mention this to all of you who live here. A few years ago, we had, at least in my memory, the worst flood. This has become a huge issue for the village of Mamaroneck, and it's beyond just the LWRP. It's into many, many other things. The Corps of Engineers is looking at strategies to try to assist the village in this flooding issue. As you know, most of all of what I still call the flats area in the village was flooded severely, and there were millions of dollars of losses. So this floodplain issue is pretty critically important, and since that time, the village has also passed has new floodplain regulations and standards. And then this next one just goes over wetlands in the village, and the village also has a relatively new, I think it's about 4 years old since adopted, wetlands regulation establishing what you can do and cannot do in a wetland area, and also a 100-foot wetland buffer to the village. So all of that is, again, sort of mapped out in the village. I don't think I will, because I don't want to take too much of my time, go over all of these details. I just want to say what's in the inventory. Where I can point out something very important, I'll try to point it out on the maps, but this next map is also very important because it overlays something that can be done both at the state level, the county level, or the local level, and it's called a critical environmental area. We were concerned, for instance, when Hampshire Country Club announced, I first heard about it just reading the Gannett paper, was up for sale. That country club is in a critical environmental area. So now the new owners have proposed that it remain as a golf club. But the critical environmental areas are areas that were deemed for a reason, because if you look at the floodplain maps, you'll find a good part of something like Hampshire Country Club is in a floodplain area. So these start to overlap one with the other in terms of critical environmental areas, wetlands, floodplain areas. This one is what Charlie McCaffrey is organizing our policies into something called the working waterfront. So what we're doing is talking, obviously, to key stakeholders, and partly through the harbor master, but also all of the boatyards in Mamaroneck. It's still partly a working waterfront, also a waterfront that has just many leisure boats. It's a very important, I think, part of the economy of the village. So that is being looked at. And then you have here just a listing, too, of some of the recreational facilities. These are the private recreational facilities. I think everyone's familiar with the large public Harbor Island Park in the middle, but there are a large number of clubs which form an important part of the fabric of the village of Mamaroneck. And in fact, I still remember a huge critical issue that had to be resolved of two, and I'm going to use the term competing, not conflicting, interests in 1984. And that was a lot of the owners of the boatyards, for instance, wanted to allow condominiums in their upland areas, residential. And the committee did not want to do that. The LWRP committee and the trustees ultimately went with the committee's recommendations with Catherine Clark to make sure that the boatyards were preserved as boatyards and the clubs were preserved as clubs. And Mamaroneck followed up on that with a marine zone, with a marine recreation zone, zones that would protect the clubs and protect the boatyards without an incursion to residential. Because I think one of the things we found in other communities is Sometimes a marina is not always profitable. Sometimes it's more of a break-even type of operation, and sometimes it will seek to just have condominiums or residential to really enhance profitability, but it's at the risk of eventually losing that marina or that club. So those are some of the things that are being looked at now in the inventory in Mamaroneck. And I just want to end or conclude with two plans. The first is, I'll just put this one. The first is a future land use plan for the LWRP. This mimics the comprehensive plan and is consistent with it of 2008, but it adds some key things. In 1984, there was a major focus on saving the clubs, saving the boatyards. It was accomplished. There's a certain focus that our committee's taking now toward public access, which is what these black circles are about, enhancing more public access for residents of the village of Mamaroneck. So that's a vision that's been incorporated in the draft right now, and I'll call it a working draft, a very preliminary draft, until we have this workshop and the trustees get into it in detail. And then finally, and the one that the harbor master is most concerned with, is actually the channel and the map of the harbor, preventing incursions on that channel and maintaining that channel. And there's a whole set of potential projects and recommendations in this working or preliminary draft plan now. So I think that's probably where I should end. And just mention again that for those of you who want to be involved in this, we're going to have a workshop again, which will be announced on the website, but it is Saturday, June 11th from 10 to 12. So thank you. 169 Mount Pleasant, which is Old Village Hall in Mamaroneck, the courthouse. So that's where it is. And we literally welcome everyone, because I'm a firm believer that of what Steve said, and that is you've got to have true public participation in this, and the public in back of the trustees in getting this accomplished. So thank you very much.